There we go. Excellent. Well, now we're going to get to the meat of it and to the fun part of this evening's presentation. A gentleman who's been a friend of the museum and has been a person with a presence in the Bay Area for a long time, although he's hailing out of Bend, Oregon right now. And that is Darren Pleasance, who's going to tell us what the experience and the life is like of bush flying in Alaska. So take it away, Darren.
All right, Jeff, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Outstanding. Let me do the couple of quick clicks here to see if we can get the presentation to show the way we want it to, and then we'll be off and running. So let me just hit one more button here, and I'll rely on you to tell me if you're seeing.
It's looking good.
Awesome, great.
And let me interrupt real quickly, Darren, just to let people know, if you have questions, to put them into the chat. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is the chat button there. So put them into chat. We'll keep tabs on them. And then after Darren's finished with his talk, we will catch all those questions. Sorry for the interruption. Go ahead, Darren.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. So, so thanks for inviting me, by the way. I enjoy this talk. It's a piece of my life that is incredibly inspiring to me. It was an amazing part of my aviation journey here. By way of background, let me just, I'm going to have this slide move forward and you'll see a build. But let me just tell you a bit more about my background. I don't actually fly for a living anymore. I do fly quite a bit, but my adventure started actually in the Bay Area, not too far from San Carlos. I grew up, at least from 10 years old on, over in Livermore. Learned to fly over there. And for those of you who know the Livermore Airport, it's an incredibly diverse ecosystem of aviation where you have access to so many dimensions, from aerobatics to warbirds and so on. And I managed to participate in all of those from the earliest ages, from 13 years old basically on, and soloed in a champ and ended up getting a lot of tailwheel experience. And I spent a lot of my formative years through my teenage years basically flying everything I possibly could, mostly out of the sort of favors of people who were excited to see a young kid who enjoyed aviation and was willing to wash airplanes and pretty much do anything needed in order to get an airplane ride. By the time I got to college down in Santa Barbara, I was getting my degree in mechanical engineering. I had gotten my private license and actually my instrument and commercial, and had become a flight instructor. And one very important evening in my life was I got invited to a talk from a fellow down there named Elwood Shapansky, who was a physics professor by school year and an Alaska bush pilot by summer. And he had been doing it for many years. And he proceeded to describe a story of adventure that completely captivated me. It was sort of everything about aviation that I could have imagined. It was tailwheel airplanes, it was landing on glaciers and sandbars and all the things that you would kind of imagine about the romance of flying in Alaska. And it just completely captivated me. And I was right between 21 and 22 years old at that time. And I was getting my master's degree in engineering, but I just couldn't get this idea of being an Alaska bush pilot out of my mind. And so about 5 months into my master's degree, I went and applied at UCSB to get a leave of absence to go up to Alaska to become an Alaska bush pilot. And of course, my advisor at the time denied me that and said, no, I was on a scholarship. I was a teaching assistant. I had all of these things going on in my life. And I just couldn't get out of my mind. So it was interesting. A friend of mine's dad was the park ranger, the lead park ranger at Denali National Park, which is the big, giant multi-million acre park up in Alaska. And I through her, I knew her dad, and I asked him if he would mail me the yellow pages to Alaska. And at that time, and maybe it's still true today, there was a yellow pages for all of Alaska. And that was mailed down to me in Santa Barbara. And I proceeded to send out form letters to every fixed base operator, basically every charter operator across all of Alaska, asking if they would be willing to hire me. And this was probably in December, January timeframe of that year. And I got essentially no responses. I started making phone calls, and essentially the answer was, or the question was, how much Alaska time do you have? Which the answer was 0. And are you here in Alaska? The answer was no. And so it became clear by around February, March of that year that the only way to really turn Alaska into some form of reality was to actually fly to Alaska and just start going door to door and hope that somebody would hire me. Along the way, I had flown all of the airplanes that you see on this page. So I had a tremendous amount of time. By the time I was 22, I had time flying aerobatics and competing. I had been flying warbirds. I had been flying jets. and I'd been flying experimental airplanes. So I'd experienced this huge diversity of aviation and just loved it. And to me, Alaska was the culmination of all of that. So I headed for Alaska, and see if we can get, there we go. And this is a picture which I'll come back to here shortly of a sort of representation of sort of sums all of my Alaska adventure into one picture, but I'll share more of that with you. It's helpful to start with just the immensity of Alaska before I get into the specifics of the journey. And so let me just run through this just to give you all appreciation, if you haven't been to Alaska, what it's like, because it is truly an amazing place. Right, it was purchased for 7.2 million way back in 1867 from Russia. So that's 2 cents an acre, so not a bad deal, and clearly a bad deal in retrospect. Russia, had they kept it, would have had access to an enormous set of resources. Is 20% the size of the lower 48. So the entire dimension of the state is actually not easily comprehended until you get up there and start flying, and you realize how far it is from east to west or north to south. And in fact, it's almost the same distance from east to west as the lower 48. And I've made several trips up to the North Slope, up to Prudhoe Bay and Barrow. And as it says, 1,400 miles, it's essentially the same distance as the entire United States, the continental United States. The population, 730,000 people. When I was there, it was 600,000. So it's grown by 130,000 people since then. But imagine Manhattan Island in New York, if there were 20 people living on the island, just to give you a sense of how unpopulated the state is. And that was part of the beauty of flying there, is you could fly for hours and hours and not see anything but caribou and moose and bear and Dall sheep and all of the animals there. Mount McKinley, the tallest mountain in North America, 20,320 feet, is a huge attraction to many mountain climbers from around the world. Is one of the top 7 peaks in the world. And so people who want to climb the top peaks have to climb Mount McKinley. And a big part of my experience up there was associated with that. The tides are interesting. They, because of the latitude of the state, you get these enormous tides where you actually see this rolling wave coming in for miles and miles as the moon pulls the tides in. And as it says here, 37 feet. So from high tide to low tide, 37-foot change in elevation. The 10 feet of snow. People think of Alaska as very snowy, which is true in the Southeast Panhandle. So if you're looking at Ketchikan, Juneau, Sitka, those places in the Southeast, it's very snowy. Some of the greatest snow falls in the entire country. But if you go up to Prudhoe Bay and Barrow, the top of Alaska, there's almost none, like 3 to 4 inches per year. It's incredibly dry, although very, very cold, and of course, dark in the wintertime. And then this is, for those of you who still continue to play Trivial Pursuit, this last point is incredibly important to remember if you want to win that game, because someone will ask you, what is the easternmost portion of the United States? And people often answer Miami or something, or maybe Bangor, Maine, or something like that. The answer is Attu, which is 172 degrees east latitude, because it is on the other side of the international date line. So a little fun fact that you can take with you from today. So with all of that in mind, and of course the vast wildlife population, which was unbelievable. The amount of wildlife you see and the sheer beauty of the landscape up there was more than enough to attract me to want to walk away from getting a master's degree in engineering to go up and try to become an Alaska bush pilot. So let me orient you to the state. What I'm going to do over the next roughly 30 minutes here is just describe my adventure. And I was there, this was a while ago now, and I go back every few years, but this adventure here I'm going to show you happened back in 1989. So back when I was just coming out of college, I had just graduated, and I flew up there, and I managed, through the series of jobs I got, to essentially see the entire state. So I'm going to walk you through that journey, just to give you a sense of what that landscape looks like and what that experience was like. So let me start with Talkeetna, which is the jumping off point for all trips up to Mount McKinley. It's where all the climbers come into. It's a scene out of Northern Exposure. It's a very small town with just a few hundred people, highly seasonal. You can get up to 1,000 people or so in the summertime, and hundreds of people in the wintertime. And it was something that started with me flying into Fairbanks. I took Alaska Airlines. I bought a one-way ticket, landed in Fairbanks, went door to door looking for a job, had heard about this exciting, interesting place called Talkeetna, where all the glacier planes flew out of. And this is a picture of me standing on the side of the road. There are very few roads in all of Alaska. And here I was hitchhiking to Denali. I wanted to go visit this park ranger who had sent me Yellow Pages that I described earlier. I wanted to go meet him and introduce myself and say thank you on my way down to Talkeetna. I arrived in Talkeetna. This is an aerial view of Talkeetna. The runway you see in the top part is where all of the Denali, the Mount McKinley flights depart out of. What you also see are the rivers flowing through the town here. The interesting color is because of all the glacial silt. So these are all rivers flowing out of the massive glaciers coming out of the Alaska range. And they are completely filled with basically ground up, almost flour-like rock that has come from the glaciers that are flowing down through the various canyons in the mountains, and yields an interesting color, very gray, milky-like color. As you head towards the Alaska range, I ended up getting a job there, flying out of Talkeetna for K2 Aviation. And here we are flying up to the Alaska range. And this is one of the days when it was clear. It was only about 25% of the time you could actually see the Alaska range. And Mount McKinley is on the right side. It's the highest peak you see in this picture. And it's about 30-ish miles away or so. Just to give you a sense, this picture was taken in around the late April, early May timeframe. So you get a sense, still quite a bit of snow, although a lot of sunshine by then, but still a lot of snow on the hills. Some of the Alaska ranges, you get closer to Mount McKinley itself, you get these stunning peaks and amazing landscapes. This is the Ruth Glacier, which flows for dozens of miles down out of Mount McKinley, out into the lowlands and flows out into the rivers. And this is coming into the Ruth Amphitheater, which is stunning. You can't really get a sense of the scale unless you're in an airplane, but these are mountains that go straight up out of the ice, thousands, like 8,000 feet straight up out of the glaciers. So it's in a little airplane, if you could see an airplane up against this, it would just be this tiny speck against this amazing grandeur of mountains and ice. Again, just another shot of the mountains. You get spectacular scenery. Again, some more of that. This is the Talkeetna Glacier. So this is base camp. This is about 7,000 feet-ish, a little above 7,000 feet. And so this is where the mountain climbers would go. If you're going to climb Mount McKinley, you start at the Talkeetna Glacier. On the right, you can see the tent, and that was Base Camp Annie, and it was a different person all the time, but it was basically the base camp with the radio that would radio back to Talkeetna and let everybody, all the pilots, know what the weather was, because it could change in an instant. And this was a one-way out, one way in, one way out landing. All glaciers, by definition, you land uphill, you take off downhill, and essentially every time they're up against a mountain. So you don't really have options for a go around. So knowing what the weather is, what the winds are, what the conditions are was critical to landing. And the way this worked is you would land, and I'll have a video of that in a second, but you would land, you'd have to add power once you touch down because you're on a slope. And then the idea was to get to the top and have enough energy to do a U-turn essentially, as we had done here, and face back down the glacier and pull the power back soon enough to where the friction of the snow would stop you in time before you started going back down the glacier, because you have no brakes. As you can see in this picture, we use wheel skis. So these were skis that were hydraulic, and you would pump them up so they were above the wheels, so you could take off from a normal airport in Talkeetna. And then as you cross the Alaska range, you'd pump them down, they would come down underneath the wheels and allow you to land on the snow. And more than once, if you didn't time it right, you would do that U-turn I described and assume you were going to come to a stop. And the next thing you noticed, you were starting to slide down the glacier again, which is why you had to keep the engine running, because if that happened, it was full throttle and you'd accelerate down and take off again and come back and try it again. So, over the years, there have been people who shut the engine off only to have the airplane slide down, and there's nothing you can do until you come to a stop at the end of the glacier or fall into a crevasse. So interesting times. Mount Foraker in the back, this was the same location, just taken from the other side. So you're in this beautiful valley with Mount McKinley on one side, Mount Foraker on the other side, and just spectacular vistas. We'll see how the video runs on a Zoom call. I don't know, but this was landing at a glacier called Mountain Home, where there's a house up on the hill built by Don Sheldon, one of the earliest of glacier landing pilots from way, way, way back when. And it's one of the most remote parts of the Alaskan range. And I just wanted to give you a sense of the landing, because you'll hear it. This is coming in a beaver. And what you'll notice is that it's one of the few places where once you land, you actually go to not quite full power, but a lot of power to keep the momentum going as the friction and the slope slow you down. So let's see whether this runs. And it's only a 15 or 20 second video, but we'll try it. can also see there's no turnaround. So this is, you're committed at this point. You are not going around at this point. You'll hear the engine. Once we touch down here, you'll hear the engine. Here it goes. And all that is just to get you to the top of the glacier so you can then do the U-turn I talked about, pull the power back in time, and hopefully stop before you slide back down. So a lot of fun and just a beautiful area.
The video looked good. We couldn't hear any audio, so we'll just add the sound effects ourselves. Of the
imagine that once it touched down, the RPMs went up. It's nothing more complicated than that. But this is what it looks like once you stop and get out. It's this amazing vista you're looking at, and this obviously it's a big tourist destination. So these are all various charter planes that have come in to let people walk around. And I tell you, the sensation of being on this glacier, there is no sound other than maybe an airplane in the distance flying in and just the wind blowing through the Alaska range. And you can see when it's clear, it's really clear. There's zero smog or any other kind of inhibitor in the air. So you can just see for hundreds of miles in many cases. You get these fun tourists. That's Mount McKinley. That's the top of Mount McKinley in the background at 20,000 feet up there. And this family was from Brazil. It's actually taken by a friend of mine, but they wanted to get a picture, this mother, father, and their kids on the glacier doing something fun. This gives you a sense. You can see the U-turns. Everyone does the U-turn in the top picture. The bottom picture shows you that that mountain house I was talking about that Don Sheldon created. You can actually rent that. If you want the ultimate adventure, you can rent that for several days at a time. It's the most pristine, unbelievable experience. And you fly to Talkeetna, they drop you off, you hike up that mountain you see in the bottom picture, you camp out, and it's the most surreal location probably in the world. If you ever want an sort of a once in a lifetime experience, look up Don Sheldon Mountain House and you can rent that. So that was the whole Alaska range. And that only goes though until the crevasses open up. So that's really early, late spring, early summer. And at that point, the mountain climbing subsides because the crevasses start to open up, the snow softens. And at some point in that period, the ability to land the planes on the glacier goes down. So I then headed from Talkeetna down to Anchorage and managed to get myself a job at a place called Wilbur's Flight Operations, which was actually even more exciting, it turned out, than up in Talkeetna, because this was a charter operator that covered the entire state of Alaska. They flew a mix of airplanes, mostly Senecas and twin Cessnas. So the entire rest of my summer was spent flying Senecas and twin Cessnas over the entire state of Alaska. A lot of it was in the Prince William Sound. And in this picture, right in the center of that red circle is the Prince William Sound. Most of us on this call may remember that from the old Exxon Valdez accident that happened way back when that resulted in one of the biggest natural disasters in the history of Alaska, if not the world. It's one of the most pristine places to fly that I've ever been. So this is Anchorage. This picture was taken about 11 o'clock at night. So this is June timeframe. And so up in Alaska, it's not, you're below the Arctic Circle here still. So the sun does set, but not until about 11 o'clock at night. And it comes up at around 3 or 4 in the morning. So you have incredibly long days. You can see Elmendorf Air Force Base in the background, the higher end part of the picture there. As you head to the east, you enter the Prince William Sound. So this gives you a sense. And again, this is June timeframe. So you still see quite a bit of snow on the mountaintops there. Did a lot of flying. I would fly passengers. I flew passengers, I flew mail, I flew caviar, salmon, sort of everything across there. If I didn't have passengers, I could take off and just level off at 50 feet and zoom along. It wasn't a 135 flight at that point, and I'd just zoom along and take pictures like this just to show how clean the air was and how beautiful the scenery was. You could see for miles and miles, and this is probably 50 miles, 60-mile visibility, and these are some of the islands in the Prince William Sound. Tons of glaciers. This is one of hundreds of glaciers that you'd fly by, and I'd look down and periodically see them calving. This is the Columbia Glacier. So this is one of the most visited glaciers in the Prince William Sound. You see the cruise ship there. This is a glacier that at one time was the fastest moving glacier, I think in the world, certainly in Alaska. And then you can debate what the reason was, but it has been shrinking over time, whether it's climate change or whatnot. It's shrinking at about 100 feet a day. It's now 1,000 feet less in thickness than it was when I was there. And it's moved back. It's about 30-mile long glacier. It's 10 miles shorter. So it's moved back from the ocean 10 miles from where it was back in the late 80s, early 90s when I was there. One of the many oil ships that were there, as I'd fly around, and it could have been an Exxon Valdez at the time. It wasn't. This was an Arco ship, but sitting outside of Valdez, which was the main port that would pick up oil coming from the North Slope, there would always be dozens of these oil tankers out there waiting to go into Valdez. This is actually on the ground in Valdez. You had the craziest weather patterns there. It just gives you a sense of the fog and the clouds, and you do these interesting instrument departures to climb up, and you'd pick up ice almost every time to climb out of this valley where Valdez was to get back to Anchorage. Periodically, I'd run into one of my co-flyers, and in this case, I was in the twin Cessna, and someone else was flying the Seneca that we flew out over the Prince William Sound. One of the interesting rules in Alaska is you have to carry a firearm because of bears. You have to carry a survival kit and a firearm. So this is in one of the native Alaskan villages in the Prince William Sound area, and we serviced all of them. So I was typically either delivering people or mail to one of the many native Alaskan villages. This is near Cordova, so just another flying alongside one of my friends. What's interesting about this picture and the next one, this was at the mouth of the Copper River, which is one of the biggest salmon fisheries. So many of you will buy salmon from a local store, and you'll see Copper River salmon. This is right here. And you'd see dozens and dozens of boats heading out in the morning. And if you'll recall, when I started this, there is a 37-foot tide. And so what happens, that's going out at some point in the day. In the afternoon, when they come back in, you can see most of it's mud, the left and right. The tides have gone out, and all you have are the boats coming back in the part that's deep enough to support them. One of the interesting things in the Prince William Sound is Middleton Island. This is an island that has nothing more than a VOR on it and an FAA weather station, and they manage the VOR there. There's nothing else there. And we had a contract to take people, the FAA employees, as well as mail out to them. What's interesting is that the story goes, apparently back in the late 60s, there was a family there with kids and husband and wife, and they brought 2 rabbits. And you know what happens with 2 rabbits, and this sign is on the island there. And it was true. You'd have to buzz the runway before you landed in order to make sure you weren't going to kill a bunch of rabbits when you touched down, because there were thousands of rabbits, and it was like the runway was alive as you touched down. One of the things that's interesting about Alaska, and this was on Middleton Island, is there are shipwrecks everywhere, and it's so far from anywhere that if a ship runs aground, it's just far too expensive to get rid of it. And so you have dozens and dozens of abandoned ships that have run aground over the years. And this was one that, I don't know how many years ago it ran aground. This is another one just flying down the Alaskan Panhandle. I'd fly low and get pictures of these ships that run aground years earlier. The next part of the adventure is part of still the same company, but we did a lot of work down in the Aleutian chain. And so I had the opportunity to fly down there. So this is going through Lake Clark Pass. So a lot of the flying there was interesting. When I first got there, I was a 135 qualified pilot, instrument rating. And the rule was when I got there that I had to fly, I could only fly IFR for the first month or so before they would allow me to fly VFR, which I found interesting. But the reality is there are way more accidents up there from VFR aircraft trying to fly through passes like this that end up encountering weather that they hadn't anticipated. And these passes, especially the high point of each pass, are littered with aluminum. You fly over these passes and you see the remnants of airplanes that have impacted the pass over the years. And they're, again, too far from anywhere to make it economically viable to go retrieve the airplanes. They'll usually go get the people who were in them, but they won't retrieve the airplanes. So you have wreckage littered throughout these passes. After I had demonstrated proficiency in the IFR world, I was allowed to start doing this, where you'd fly the passes and just spectacular scenery. Obviously, the Aleutian chain is a chain of volcanoes. And so you fly through these passes. This is coming up on Lake Clark itself, and you're surrounded by volcanoes on every side. This is, I forget the name of this lake, but it's on the way out to Merrill Pass, heading out towards the west. This is Mount Spur. This one, I forget how, it wasn't that many years ago, this one erupted. Many of the volcanoes up there are active. Some are dormant, but that just means, not yet active again. And so I know Spur, this one here erupted not that long ago. This one here also, this is Mount St Augustine, also erupted. You can see it's spewing smoke. So just, again, spectacular scenery for flying. The fishing was spectacular. I did a lot of my charter flights were for fishermen, fisherwomen who came up who wanted to go to exotic locations. So this is down at Lake Iliamna. And you can sort of see it in this picture but it's just a ribbon, thousands and thousands. All you have to do is drop your hook in the river and you're pulling fish out. I had this goofy hat I wore while I was up there the whole time. And we were, unlike my bush flying when I was up doing the glacier stuff, the company I work for here liked us to dress a little more professionally. So I always had a tie on and I had my epaulets on my shoulders. And I would always bring a fishing pole with me because every airport pretty much is alongside of a river in Alaska. And sometimes I'd be there for 6 or 7 hours on a charter of some sort. So I would grab my fishing pole and just go out and catch, mostly catch and release, although I keep quite a bit of it because there's a lot of good salmon up there. What's interesting is if we now go to the west, the landscape changes dramatically. And so just to give you a sense, what you saw earlier was, the Alaska Range or the Prince William Sound with glaciers and snow, or the Aleutian Chain, we've got volcanoes. You cross the Alaskan Range and go west, and it's tundra as far as the eye can see. And it's in the middle part of Alaska where this picture was taken, down by a place called McGrath. You see a lot of, shrubs and trees, obviously. As you go north towards places like Nome, or even further north toward Barrow and Prudhoe Bay, it gets increasingly flat. You're above the tree line, even at sea level, essentially. You're above the tree line as you go further north. And the visibility becomes almost unlimited, as you'll see in this picture here. This is probably, 150 mile visibility. And as you can see, it's flat as can be. And these are all basically permafrost areas where the permafrost is melted. And when it melts, it creates a divot, which creates a space for the water to settle. And this is still several hundred miles from the North Slope, basically Prudhoe Bay and Barrow. I did not take this picture, but this takes you out towards Nome and Kotzebue. I became good friends with this physics professor who inspired me to go to Alaska, Elwood. And so he and I share pictures. So this is his picture, but that big chunk of ice you see there, just to give you a sense of the scale, if I go closer, it's hard to see in this picture, but the top right corner, there's a helicopter up there that's just a tiny little thing. That was several hundred feet high of a big piece of ice in the Bering Sea that had just rotated basically and turned vertical. And so again, the scale of what you see in Alaska is immense. One of the things I did out west was working for the Bureau of Land Management. So we were contracted. I still work for Wilbur's flight operations, but we were contracted with the Bureau of Land Management to go help with the firefighting. You get these tundra fires that are hundreds of acres of land. And for the most part, they don't care. They don't try to put out 100,000 acre fire. They don't try to put out 100,000 acre fire in general, but what they do try to do is protect villages and homesteads. And so what you see on the line here, you see a T-28 there, you see a Aero Commander. I was the Seneca, third airplane from the left. You see a Twin Otter at the far end down there. This was like a MASH unit. It was 24/7. It was just right. It was a place called Galena, which was just south of the Arctic Circle. So the sun did drop, but my shift was from 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. And then I had a colleague who did 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. And our job was basically to support all the firefighting operations. Mostly what I did was take a mapper and we would climb up high and we would map where the fire was today. And we would compare that to where it was yesterday. And they could get a sense for how the fire was moving. And then we would then separately fly low over the rivers to figure out if there's any homesteads who would be at risk of the fire overwhelming them. We were surrounded by smoke jumpers. And if any of you have ever spent time with smoke jumpers, they're the most crazy and fun group of people, because these are basically firefighters who also know how to parachute. And they would go out with their axes and shovels and they would parachute into a homestead generally, and they would build a perimeter with their axes and shovels, and then helicopters would come pick them up and take them out. So we all had a great time, and food was running 24/7. It was a really cool experience. To give you a sense of kind of the MASH sort of experience, hauling supplies all over. And this was one of the shots from part of my job. I would come up to about 10,000 feet, get above the smoke, and I would have an observer with me that worked for the Bureau of Land Management, and they would basically sketch out where that line was, where the burnt area had moved, so they could compare it to the prior day. You had these, again, massive fires. Some of them go up to sometimes 12, 13, 14,000 feet. And again, for the most part, they wouldn't care too much about this. There was no attempt to try to put that fire out because Mother Nature would eventually put it out itself, but there was an interest in saving property. One of the things we did was we would go out and recruit people to fight these fires. And what was interesting, I thought was sort of humorous too, was in the early days, for cost reasons, if a fire would start up, they would go to the nearest Native Alaskan village and recruit maybe 100 Native Alaskans to come out and just run the fire lines. And what they noticed was that the frequency of fires started to go up. And these are all clever folks, and they realized that if they would set a fire near their village, the Bureau of Land Management would come and they would pay them crazy amounts of money to actually come and fight the fire they had just set. And so the rules changed to where you had to be, I think it was 50 or 100 miles from the fire to recruit a village, and then they would fly them back in that Twin Otter to fight the fire. And that was to reduce the incentive for local villages to set fires around them. So this was at about 3 o'clock in the morning. We had landed in this small village, and the people you can see walking away on the left, walking into that village to go begin to recruit people to go fight a fire that was hundreds of miles away. This is about 3 o'clock in the morning. That's the Twin Otter that was picking up people, and I was in the Seneca at the time. So it gives you a sense the sun would come down to the horizon around 3 in the morning and then go back up again. It was never dark. The sun was always up that time of year because we were above the Arctic Circle at this village. Just another sense of what it looks like at 3 in the morning there. Another thing we did out west was gold mines. As if you've all watched Gold Rush Alaska, there is a huge amount of gold mining up there. And this is a picture of one of the many gold mines I flew into. The runway is part of the gold mine itself. This is a closer picture of it. So you get a sense of what it looks like. Almost every airport up there is some form of gravel or dirt or sandbar or whatever it is. And the approach in here was to fly up the river and then hang a hard left turn going upriver and then drop into this thing. And this is a charter. I would go out there periodically to take the bookkeeper out there. They would set me up with that pan you see in the middle. I would sit and they would just let me sluice and basically do panning for gold. And I've got in my other room here, I've got a bunch of little nuggets that I found while I would sit there and pan. And they were kind enough to let me do that. I don't think it's worth more than probably several $100s of gold, but it was fun just to sit there and pretend to be a gold miner. The other thing we did a lot of was flying to these Native Alaskan villages for Alascom, and you can't really see it, but in the top right corner, that house up there, you can see a half arc shape. Pretty much every Native Alaskan village has a satellite to provide telecommunications into that village. And you see these little small buildings are where the dog teams live. So these are true, although the houses have improved, let's say over the years, they still are subsistence livers, foragers. They live on a river. They've got dog teams to get around in the wintertime. As I said, every time I would go someplace, I would grab my fishing pole. And so this was Lime Village was the name of it. And I would sit on the river for hours while the Alascom technician that I'd flown out there would go work on the equipment. And I would sit out there and fish for various sorts of fish. One of the things I did a lot too, as we come down the home stretch here, is did a lot of contract with the military. And there's a ton of military bases. This was back in the Cold War era, especially. You had SAC bases up there, Strategic Air Command bases. You had F-15 scrambling, and you had a bunch of radar sites out in the middle of nowhere. And so this is a runway that, if you were to see the IFR approach plate, had a crazy number of warnings and cautions and all these things, missed approach, improbable, things like that, because you were landing on this runway that could support a C-130, as you see in the picture, but it had this amazing ski slope kind of dimension to it, with a very steep slope at the end. And right at the end, to the right of this picture, which you can't see, is a giant mountain that goes up about 3,000 feet, on top of which is a radar site that they would use to track potential Russian incursion on Alaska. We hauled a lot of mail. So this is a picture of me stopping in one of the various Western, we did this sort of big loop every morning. We'd fly out to Western Alaska and drop off mail, go between these villages. So this is a Seneca here, and they'd bring that front loader out, load all the mail, and then give me a bunch of stuff to take with me. Spent a lot of time flying between villages. This was not uncommon weather where you've got maybe a 700-foot overcast. You could file IFR, but it's not controlled airspace. You can go IFR without a clearance. For those of you who have read the regulations in detail, you only need a clearance to fly IFR in controlled airspace. You don't need a clearance to fly IFR in uncontrolled airspace. And there's a ton of uncontrolled airspace in Alaska. It just created more challenges. So often you just take off and fly low, like I'm doing here. And it was, I'd done it enough times down a river valley that wasn't risky. It wasn't like I was weaving between mountains, and there's certainly no power lines to run into out there. You get great weather stuff, just these cool, vistas with rainbows and other kinds of interesting weather experiences. The stuff you carry was amazing. I was lucky. I worked for a company that cared about weight and balance, so I was never pushed to fly. You know, you hear all these Alaska horror stories of people flying, being asked to really exceed what the airplane was designed for. I was never asked to do that. In fact, we had to weigh everything. But despite that, you take a Cessna 402, which this was, and because it's expensive to fly up there, they would pack it with everything under the sun to make the most of these trips. You get a sense of what they carried there. My first flight with Wilbur's was this one. And if you look closely, you may not be able to see it depending on how big your screen is, but there's a giant ship's wheel in the back of the Seneca. I had a pregnant woman with a baby on her lap that was sitting in that one seat that was available. All the rest of what you see in there, the cat carrier, and I don't know what else was in there, and a giant ship's wheel. And that was a 2-hour charter from Anchorage out to this little village in the middle of nowhere in Western Alaska. So you got just some interesting experiences there. The guy that I flew the most with Alascom took his golden retriever everywhere he went. So he would load the Seneca up with every possible piece of technical equipment to test all these pieces of equipment in these native Alaskan villages, and he would bring his golden retriever with him. So we spent a lot of hours flying around Alaska. I did a lot of work for mining companies, and I was the only one allowed to be on the airplane, but I flew dynamite, blasting caps, everything under the sun, down to these various mines. And then this was one of the more interesting trips. You really don't get a full appreciation for it, but you see the Seneca there. There's a guy behind the wing. That was a Brinks guard. This was an interesting trip where I had a ship's captain who ran a fish processing boat in the Bering Sea south of King Salmon. And at least back in those days, they paid all the fishermen in cash. They'd come into these big fish processing boats with their catch. If you've all seen Deadliest Catch, it's mostly filmed in the Bering Sea. And this was a trip to take $1 million in cash down to that fish processing boat. And so they had hired Brinks. And so that guy there is a Brinks guard. On his hand, he had a handcuff and a metal case with $1 million in cash. And this was in King Salmon. We stopped for fuel on our way down to a little Alaskan village down on the Bering Sea. Other interesting thing as I wrap up here, even the airlines were unique up there. Here you see the bleed air is used. They land on beaches and on gravel runways up there, and they're carrying fish and passengers and all that. And so here's an example of an older 737 where they had the bleed air, and it's blowing away the rocks to keep them obviously from coming up into the engine. And they had just modified them to handle the realities of the types of runways you have to land on up in Alaska. I did have an engine failure up there. This is me coming in. A friend of mine came out to take this picture, and engine failed on the right. So you can see I feathered the right engine and had to come back and land, and wasn't a big deal. The 402 did great on one engine, and obviously a nice VFR day, as you can see there, but it was nice to know that it wasn't that big a deal to have an engine failure. You spend a lot of time digging yourself out. Almost every runway is soft, and it isn't a big deal. You go to make a turn, and all of a sudden you feel the whole airplane sink in, and you just forget it. You shut the engines off, let your passengers out like I had in this case. You get out and you dig it out and you make a nice smooth thing, and then you can get it moving. And it's the ultimate in soft field technique, because if you stop again, or if you turn too sharply, you end up right back like that. But if you kind of get your technique down where you can keep it moving and don't stop, you don't have to go out and dig it out again. And so I did a lot of short and soft field landings, which you end up having to do a lot of together. Usually in the lower 48, you practice either short or soft field landings. Up in Alaska, a lot of both. Another example is, in this case, it was both the main gear and the nose gear that it dug in, and you get out and just dig it out. And this is the last picture. This is not my picture. This was actually this was the very first day when I arrived in Alaska. I bought a one-way ticket on Alaska Airlines, and I was on my way to Fairbanks, as I talked at the beginning. And it was one of those very few spectacular days when the entire state of Alaska was clear. And that's Mount McKinley. You could see the snow blowing off the top of it. And I was in a 727 for Alaska Airlines, and I looked out the window and took a picture. And so I'll wrap up with that. That was sort of a summation of this amazing experience I had getting a chance to fly across Alaska. So Jeff, with that, I'm gonna, I guess, turn it back to you to see if people have questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Darren. That is a fabulous sort of a tour of Alaska, and a day and a year in the life of an Alaskan bush pilot. I don't think there's anyone in aviation, I guess I could speak for myself at least, that doesn't have some romantic feeling about what it might be like to be a bush pilot in Alaska. I know that people probably have some questions, and I'll give them a chance to type type them into the chat. I know I have a couple of questions, so I'm going to start it off right away. Speaking of romance, the whole McKinley, Denali area, you know, anyone interested in mountaineering and that whole lore and history of what goes on at Mount McKinley is intimately connected with the glacier flying onto Talkeetna Glacier. And there's a lot of romance around just the air taxi services. So you had Talkeetna Air Taxi, right? That's the Sheldon one. And then
Yep.
you were with K2 Aviation. Are those like concessions and those are the only ones that can fly out of Talkeetna, or is there like competition between different?
There's a bunch. Yeah, there's Talkeetna Air Taxi. There was, I don't think Doug's still going, but Doug Geeting Aviation at the time, K2 Aviation, and K2 got bought by Rust Aviation. Rust was the biggest operator out of Lake Hood, which is down in Anchorage. And so there are several out of there. They're all great. I mean, they're all great owners. They all care about safety. You know, it's in their vested interest to have people have a great experience. So, you know, K2 was the biggest at the time when I was there, but and I think it probably still is given Rust bought them. But yeah, there's lots of places you can go with, and they'll go to many more places than just Mount McKinley. Right. So what's fascinating is Talkeetna as a hub to sort of experience a ton of exciting, interesting places in that area.
Yeah, definitely on the bucket list. I know a lot of people will probably be familiar a little bit with Alaska flying because on the Discovery Channel for a couple of years, there was Flying Wild Alaska,
Great
which
show.
was the Tweeto family and their airline Era Alaska. So that was a little bit after when you were there, but did you ever have any encounter with those people, or what did you think?
With them? No, but like, you know, there's definitely a great book, by the way, if you haven't read it, Wager with the Wind. It was written by Don Sheldon. If you haven't read that book, Wager with the Wind, it gives you a sense of the early days of bush flying. And it's, and, you know, Don Sheldon was sort of you know, he was the guy that really created Talkeetna. He created the concept of one of a handful. I'm not sure if he's the only one, but he certainly was one of the early pioneers of landing on glaciers and a lot of the other stuff they did up there. And so it's a great book. It's a page turner for sure. I didn't encounter the Tweedles per se, but I encountered a lot of personalities because they are frankly just representative of a diverse ecosystem of interesting personalities who have embraced aviation. In reality, if you're going to live in Alaska, you kind of have to embrace aviation because there really aren't that many roads. And so, you know, the number of pilots per capita up there, I think is higher than anywhere else in the world for the reason that you really can't go anywhere if you only drive.
Well, you point out something that's important. Don Sheldon, for instance, you have to have this entrepreneurial sense because, you know, he obviously saw Talkeetna and said, this is actually a gateway and it can be exploited in a sustainable way and create a whole industry around. And what are some of the other examples of that? I can think of, like, you know, landing on sandbars and creating a whole industry of getting fishermen and sports people in and out of, you know, remote areas.
Yeah, I mean, the way airplanes get used, yeah, so for sure, hunters and fishermen, that's a huge ecosystem. Obviously, fishing up there is massive. So the amount of airplanes, we had, you know, these you know, short, what do they call it? The shorts, 360, short 360. I mean, all these interesting airplanes, high wing, twin engine, sort of like mini cargo vans that would just be filled from bottom to top with fish. And the amount of fishing up there that goes on and the use of airplanes. I mentioned gold mining, as you saw, and you saw the blasting caps and dynamite and stuff. You know, tourism, even just scenic tours. If any of you go to Alaska, if you haven't been there, it's got to be a bucket list thing for you to go up there. And I can send you, Jeff, if people want to get it from you. I wrote up a sort of Alaska on a budget thing for people that don't have the thousands of dollars to go spend on it. You can go up on somewhere between a 7-day and 10-day trip up there. And I said, if I didn't have a lot of money, how would I go get what I would call 90% of the Alaska experience on 10% of the budget? And I wrote up something that I've given to lots of my friends. I'm happy to share it with you if others on this want that. Because it tells you how to go up to Denali and experience that, spend some time in Talkeetna, experience the train that runs from Talkeetna to Anchorage, spend some time in Prince William Sound, and maybe down onto the Kenai Peninsula. You can do all that and get an incredible taste of Alaska without having to spend the thousands of dollars it would cost to fly out to some of the more remote places. Because even a little bit remote is still more remote than anything you would get in the lower 48.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some people might be interested in that. I know I would.
I'll send it to you. I love sharing it. And others who have used it have found it quite useful.
One of the questions we have relates to the danger of bush flying, and this relates also to something we were talking about before the program, which was, it seems to be an obvious thing. Go to Alaska, learn some incredible skills in that harsh environment, and boy, you can get a job anywhere in the airlines or whatever. But there's also a risk, right? I mean, you can bend up airplanes in Alaska, and you will have to explain that at every job interview you ever have. So how would you kind of rate this whole riskiness of building an aviation career in a place like Alaska?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly more dangerous because it taxes all the dimensions of flying that you would think, the weather aspects, short runways, soft runways, decision-making, judgment, all of those things for sure get taxed. I mean, there are people for sure who fly up there for an entire lifetime, right, and do it successfully without dying. So it can be done. I knew one fellow that I flew with that did not make it through the summer. He ended up hitting a mountain that hit the Alaska range. As I mentioned, I flew across a lot of passes where you look down and you realize there are pilots who maybe were as good as you were, who just made a poor choice. And so for me, it was mostly around decision-making, right? You do have a choice at any point in time. Do you keep going or do you turn around? And I was lucky. I didn't work for a company that pushed me to have to make the flight or to fly over gross or do the things that do happen up there. So I think if you can just use a bit of judgment, pick a good company that actually cares about maintenance and cares about, being thoughtful about how hard they push their pilots. I think it actually can be done safely. And I had several friends who bent airplanes. They didn't hurt themselves or their passengers, but one guy was landing on the Glacier, had a 20-knot tailwind, and he kind of came around the corner and it started going up, and the winds had just changed. And next thing you knew, the touchdown point was going underneath the airplane, and he was still at 30 feet in the air, and he just had to get it on the ground quickly because there is no go around. And then you have crevasses down the landing area. So we basically just stomp on the rudder, and it kind of twisted over and bent the landing gear and hit the wing, and didn't total the airplane, but the airplane had to be helicoptered out of there. So it's not a good deal. So he wrecked an airplane, but nobody got hurt. So those do happen, but most of the places I saw, if you were thoughtful and exercise, call it reasonable judgment, it was not like a fait accompli that you were going to wreck an airplane or kill yourself. You could manage your way around that if you were a bit thoughtful.
That's good to hear. Question that is being asked, and I can phrase it this way. So what was your closest call? You mentioned.
Yeah, I love it. I see Jim's question here. And Jim's an awesome guy. Jim has a husky and a fellow I know and pilot as well. It's a longer story than I probably have time for here. So I'll give you the short version of that story. You remember I talked about the Brinks guard with $1 million cash. When I got down to it, there were two airports, Igiugig and Igigik, which are both Native Alaskan airports. I was supposed to go to Igiugig, which was actually reasonable airport, probably a 3,000-foot runway, gravel, no big deal. The ship's captain wanted to go to Igiugig, which is on the other side of the thing, and it turns out it was a beach. And there were other airplanes. There was a Beaver down that landed on the beach. I was in a Seneca with little tires about that big that was not designed to go land on beaches. And short version of long story is, he harassed me about how much money he had spent, and that if I was going to land him over at Igiugig and not Igigik, that I was going to strand him from his ship, and that this thousands of dollars he had spent was not going to be acceptable. So I dropped the Brinks guard off. I took this captain and the rest of his crew, and I noticed above the beach there was a little tiny airport with a couple small airplanes parked there, Cessna 170 and a Super Cub. And so I came and I landed there. I used the entire strip, and I ended up at the end, and I sank into the dirt. They got off and they walked away. The villagers all came out and they were all scratching their head. They said they'd never seen a twin engine airplane in that airport ever before. And again, long story short, it was a 700-foot runway. And by now, at least I was light. It was just me and an airplane I'd burned most of the fuel off of. But I got the airplane dug out. It was a soft runway. I turned around, went back to the end, questioning if I'd made a bad choice. I went to full throttle on the Seneca. It sucked up all this dirt. It covered the airplane with dirt. They were still down at the end of the runway, 700 feet away, burying the holes in the ground that had been created from my airplane that had sunk. And they scattered as I got to the end. And all I remember is barely seeing the airspeed indicator starting to come off the peg. And I grabbed the flaps. So those of you who know Seneca, they're manual flaps. And we've been taught this too. You can add instant flaps on an airplane, which will give you instant lift, instant drag too, but instant lift. And I went to full flaps in the Seneca, which I believe was 40 degrees. And there's this like flash of green, which was my propellers going through the bushes at the end of the runway. And then I was flying. And I remember the little shaking, and I was, holy cow. So I didn't raise the landing gear. I didn't do anything. This was like 40 minutes from the time I had landed to when I went through the bushes at the end. And I flew back over to where the Brinks guard was waiting, and he was pissed off because he thought for sure I had crashed. And now he's stuck in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles from anywhere. And I got out of the airplane, and there were sticks and branches and everything in the landing gear. The back of the props, which all of you who are pilots at least will know are black, right? The back of propellers are painted black. They were completely polished aluminum. I had sucked up so much dirt, it had sanded all the paint off the propeller. And I remember just going, that was super, super stupid. So I pulled all this stuff out. It didn't damage anything. I got super lucky. And that was the one that I was like, that was dumb. That was bad judgment. I knew better. I should have just told the guy he was out of luck. I should have gone to where I was supposed to. And so I remember that like it was yesterday. And you know, that reminds me every time when it comes to judgment, that was purely my choice. I could have chosen to do something different, and I got lucky. I don't think I would have killed myself. What more likely could have happened is I would have hit the tundra at the end and not had quite enough flying speed. Probably would have torn off the gear, and I would have slid to a stop, ruined the engines, ruined the airplane, and had to explain that. So I got lucky, and that was sort of my one really close call that I remember back to a lot, and it reminds me about my role in the decision-making process of flying.
Well, and speaking of that, and I guess we can wrap it up here. You know, for a pilot that flies a Cessna 172 and just lands on a paved runway, we'll compare apples to apples. On a day when you know you're going to do an arrival at a paved airport, and you're looking at the weather reports, what is the worst or the fastest crosswind that you would look at and go, oh, that's still not a problem?
Oh, I feel pretty good. And it's like 20, it depends on the gust factor, I guess, but 20 knots, I feel pretty good. And, you know, a lot of obviously every airplane has some kind of crosswind component that's at least in the book. You know, growing up, there was and still a good friend of mine, Al Kanab over in Livermore, who owned a pit, still does, actually has a Kristen Eagle over there. And I remember winter days in Livermore where you get the wind out of the north, it'd be howling at like 15 to 20 knots, straight 90 degrees to the runway. And I remember for Al, that was the best day to go flying because one, nobody else is out there. And you could take off with a right crosswind, do a left 90, a right 270, land with a left crosswind, take off right 90, left 270, land with the right, and you go back and forth doing these. And so he taught me a ton about crosswind landings. And so to me, I enjoy crosswind landings. I'll go out here, especially a tailwheel. I love crosswind landings in a tailwheel because they're just such a fun challenge. And even the pits, I owned a pits for many years. And although they're tricky airplanes, the rudder is one of the most effective rudders of any airplane I've ever flown. And so crosswind itself is actually not that intimidating as long as you keep the airplane straight. That's the key.
Yeah, I always found that a headwind isn't really a headwind, it's two crosswinds because it keeps changing while you're trying to bring it in.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Darren. It was a fascinating talk, gave us all a chance to live vicariously the life of an Alaskan bush pilot. Let's give Darren a little bit of a round of applause using the reaction button on Zoom. Thumbs up or give him a hand clap. We can do something like this as well. So thank you for that. It was fascinating. And we look forward to seeing you down here in the Bay Area too, one of these days here at the Hiller Aviation Museum, now that we're open again. So again,
you have to share my contact info. I know it was on the last slide of my deck, but you're welcome to share it. I'm happy if people have any questions, whether it's about Alaska or lots of other aviation stuff, I'm happy to share anytime. And I'll send you that Alaska on a budget thing that I mentioned too. So
okay. Well, then on that subject, if people are interested in that, I guess what we'll do is a bit of a relay. Email me, jeff@hiller.org, if you're interested in the information that Darren put together on the budget way to explore Alaska, all the bucket list items. I will then send it to you that way. So that way we can have an intermediate there. So again, jeff@hiller.org. Just let me know, and then I'll send that to everybody who might be interested. So thank you, Darren. We appreciate it. It was a fascinating talk. And we look forward to seeing everybody 2 weeks from now when we host our guest, Frank Marrero, with the talk about Lincoln Beachey, the greatest aviator of all time. Until then, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you here on the weekends at the Hiller Aviation Museum. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.